My name is Adam Hamilton, application engineer here at CAD Technology Center, and the topic of today's conversation is Revit for visualization, making it real. A lot of these webinars, a lot of these topics have come through requests through our support department regarding workflows, fixes, and in the process of dealing with our clients, we've started to put together a direction for people as they're starting to learn visualization, as they're starting to take Revit to that next level. Some of the basic things they're not doing correctly or not thinking about within the Revit environment. And so when we're talking about reality, the photorealistic rendering and the getting our renderings, our rendered views to look more real. What we've run into are people not using good content, using the default out-of-the-box materials, and we're going to talk a little about that, and then discussing lighting and lighting options, as well as a few other things that I've come across and that we should talk about throughout this conversation. One of the big things we deal with is regarding the content, and that's because a lot of the models built for visualization are dealing with out-of-the-box content versus downloaded content or content intended for visualization. The other thing to consider is that visualization, it's about detail level, which is counterintuitive to production. During production, we want clean documents. For visualization, we need to add those little things in, the extras, the things that trick your eye into believing it's real. So I'm going to shoot over to my Revit here. I have a view created here, just a small little room, and what I wanted to do is bring in just a few pieces of content. One of the first things that people will add into the Revit environment, the rendering environment for content, is to add in things like computer screens or to add in pictures, so paintings on the wall, magazines on a carousel. Again, computers or TVs showing screens. And so one of the things that we do to bring stuff in is on the Insert tab we have these decals. And decals allows us to bring in these images, and if I hover my mouse here quick, you can kind of see that the family exists as a piece of content, and the preview image they're showing here is a TV on a stand. Well, that TV is default Revit content, and so is the stand. But when I hit the render button for me to have an image on the screen, it's a decal. So we have to bring those in. So we have the ability to place decals or create decals. And so we have decal types. The decal types dialog box allows you to create separate types because it has to manage those images and pulls them in. When we place decals in our images, here we see I've created one. It's called Art. It's pathed to a network location. And that way, using those image files, we can bring them in. The decals also have settings specific to it, and so there's a little bit of bump. Again, if you were doing we're going to be talking more about bump when we talk about materials, but if you were doing a piece of art on the wall and you want to give it that actual paint texture, you can increase bump. There's luminance, and again, when we talk about materials and lighting, we're going to talk about illuminated materials, but when we bring in a decal, a TV screen, or a laptop screen, we want to be able to make it glow like it's on, and so we have these settings for luminance. Transparency, Again, this is talking more about materials, but transparency allows us to see through things, and so we're able to apply images to appear in renderings that are able to be seen through, have reflective, are bright, illuminated, have bump and cutouts, and so we manage those decals through our decal types. Now again, decals don't show up until rendered, and so as I pull up this rendered view I have, ta-da, here's a picture of Adam. That's me on the wall, and so what you saw without the image, okay, what you saw in just the standard 3D view is just the blank picture frame, just a standard family I built. And there is nothing on it in even realistic mode, as you see here, realistic mode. The images do not show up, though if here I have it selected. It is a decal. It's stretchable, it has its proportions, and those proportions can be locked. But the image does not show up until rendered, and so here you see some materials. But upon rendering, the image will show. And so these are good pieces to have. Art is a popular one to add to walls. TV is a popular one to add to rooms. We've done some multifamily residential. We've done hotel rooms. If you're doing an office and want to show some computer screens, there's a little bit of management to take care of these. It adds a little bit of weight to the project, so understand that. And so it's good to know those things about it. But once we have these decals, it can render. Another thing too is there's a misconception regarding sending things up to a cloud. We've rendered in the cloud. Decals do get sent up there, and so if you're using cloud rendering, decals will be sent up there and be placed inside your renderings. Okay? So content is a big thing. Another thing about content is where do we get content? And so I have a web page brought up here, and here we have a couple different things. I have Seek available here, and Seek you're able to download and search through content. The Revit out-of-the-box content is adequate. However, the out-of-the-box content can be a little too generic, and so architecture tab, the component button, whether we're going to the library families and looking for furniture, the seating is one I like to show off a lot because a lot of these chairs are the default chairs that have existed in Revit since before Autodesk owned Revit. And so a lot of these families are well out of date, out of style. In fact, this chair was actually, I last found it in watching some movies from the 80s. I know it's still in use, but it was kind of funny. It was featured in Weekend at Bernie's. So knowing that it's still floating around in our Revit content is kind of a humorous thing. So where do we get new content? The biggest thing is Autodesk supports. From the Insert tab, we have this Seek button. You're able to search for different manufacturers, and it takes you to this Seek site. And from Autodesk Seek, you're able to manage over, as they advertise here, 66,000 BIM families. Another thing to note is a lot of companies will advertise a certain line of content here on Seek, but check out the web. There are other places to go. This is the Autodesk one, and I wanted to start with that, but there are other places to go as well, especially if you're looking for just odd content. And so we have Revit City is another option that people will frequently go to. And the only reason I bring it up in this one, normally I wouldn't, but the reason I would is because you get a lot of one-offs. And so when you're looking for maybe a particular piece of content, the user-based content is being built for users who didn't find what they need elsewhere. The manufacturer isn't making it, and so we need to make it, and so we'll pop it up in here. And so there's a lot of content that's able to be found that are one-off. Again, user beware. Everyone take a look at that. But last I heard that they've been virus checking and stuff for Revit City, but this is all user-generated content. Autodesk Seek is built to a standard, and so it has certain specifications and requirements it must meet. Revit City is more user created, and so just download it, check it out, look at the rating system, and see if it's something that is something you want to look into. But the content is very important when we talk about Revit. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is materialization. And materials in Revit, I can go on for hours, so I'm just going to have a brief little conversation. But know one thing, that the number one, the key point I'm going to look at here is the majority of the out-of-the-box content have the wrong scale, or it's using low-resolution images. And so we've got to take a look at that. Know that materials have bump, they have texture, they have cutouts. They should not be just flat. And that's a lot of the issue we get is people go and render something and say, hey, this looks really flat. And so you got to manage these things. There are certain buttons that we're going to look at in a second. And know that these are actually not materials. Though it's under materials, they are called assets. And what is the difference between materials and assets? Okay. So inside the Revit environment, I'm going to go to my Manage tab, and I have the Material dialog box. And again, this Material dialog box is the overall, the managed one. Otherwise, most families, as you see here, have materials. And when you choose material, there's the triple dot button that will take you to the Material dialog box as well when you're choosing specific materials for specific content. So here I am. I'm going to jump through to the Materials dialog box. Know that the Material dialog box, by the way, has little panels that can fly around and shift around, and so unless you're seeing all 4 windows, check some of those buttons. So there are the materials we have in our project. Revit also comes installed with 2 material libraries. Those material libraries are locked because they are the default Revit. We do recommend companies create specific libraries for the companies, for the custom materials they're about to be building. Now, what we see here is any one of these materials, as I select them, have identity and graphics, appearance. There's also physical and a thermal, and these tabs are called assets. We have materials by name. We have the assets assigned to them. So any material we have here can have these assets. However, when I choose the appearance asset, it's important to look at a few different things. First of all, assets can be shared. We see this little hand holding a 0, and that is because we have this particular asset called clear light. Notice that it is different than the material name called illuminated glass. Okay, that is because we have different materials can share one asset. In case we have things such as, well, here's gypsum wallboard, but if I was to make gypsum wallboard for the ceiling because I want a different surface pattern on it versus gypsum wallboard for my walls where I wouldn't want a surface pattern, I can have 2 different material names pointing to the same render appearance so that it renders the same. Okay, and so that we have shared assets. And be careful as we go through this because different materials can be shared. There's not too much in this project, which is fine, but just know that each one of these pay attention to the shared amount of the assets. Now, you can always replace this asset. There's an asset browser that we're going to look at in a second, or duplicate, because this might be a good starting spot. I want to use this one, but I want to make modifications to it. So there's the ability to duplicate assets. Now, when we talk about assets, and I'm going to open up the asset browser here for this reason, when we talk about assets, there are different types. Okay, there are different types of assets. Okay, first of all, there's appearance assets, there's physical assets, there's thermal assets. But then there's also the type of appearance asset. And so we have things like ceramic, generic, masonry. Scroll down here, there's also metals, plastics, a mirror, okay? Solid, stone, so there's glazing or glass, plastic, stone, paint, water, wood. Now these are the basic types of assets, and each asset has different options. And so if I jump back over here to my material browser, you'll see that this is a generic. This is a generic asset, and it has certain settings. If I chose that's a generic, here's a plastic, and plastic has different settings. Here's a stone, and again, different settings. And these are tuned toward the material type that you're going to be looking at. Different wood can have certain settings for wood. Okay, so know that there are differences between the asset type when you're creating them. Okay, but each one of these assets, okay, each one of these assets has an image. The image is tied to a material, and that material is, as you see in the preview here, coming from a specific location. Okay, and this one's perfect. I love this one because it's calling out this beechwood Galliano. But if you look through it, it's saying that it's calling out textures 1, mats. And that's important because from this file, okay, there's a location, program files, common files, shared materials, textures. Because when we go to textures, there's a folder 1, 2, and 3, and that's low res for 1, medium res for 2, and 3 is high res. Okay, and so this particular image was actually coming out of the low image, the low res images. Okay, and so you'll see in here several low res images. Okay. But if we go into the high-res images, notice we've jumped in size by a factor of 10. Okay, we went to 100 and some K to a 2.5K. Okay. So it's good to take a look at these. Know also that there are more images in the there's about I want to say almost 1,000 image available images inside these material libraries, okay? And that there are more images available than there are materials available. So when you're going to create new materials, take a look in these folders, see what's available, because there's a lot of good stuff in here that you can use. But here, this beechwood Galliano, I run through and find it. There it is. That's the high-res version versus the low-res version. Okay, and just by swapping it out, I now have a lot higher resolution base image. Okay. Now, by the way, we're getting some questions as they come through, and a lot of these questions are will be answered as I talk. It's all part of the thing here. Now, also, as I was saying before, most of the standard images have a size, a default size, and so when we select the image itself, we get the texture editor. Okay. And here it is, this wood size has a standard 2'3" by 2'3". And so if we were to render this, that's 27 inches by 27 inches. And that's almost like having popsicle sticks laying on your floor. And so it doesn't give you a good, accurate image. And now that we have this nice high-res image, we would like to get it to match. And so pay attention to where the dimension, this 2'3", is going. And if I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 rows. That's 12. divided by 27. So we are quite literally talking very tiny. Okay. But when we want this to be a true piece of wood and then maybe a nice high quality, so if I want 4-inch slats of wood, now 4 times 12 is 48. That's 4 feet, not 2'3". So when we come down to this scale, this scale is either is usually set too low, it's usually set to the wrong, or that it's a linked scale, and these boards aren't that wide. So I'm going to unlink it. I'm going to change the height, because that's the vertical here, the height. Instead of 2'3", I'm going to type in 48, so 48 inches. And so now I'm using 4-inch width boards. And the length. If I look really hard in here, the 2'3" is 2 pieces of wood long. That's 1 foot 1.5 per board. We just put some hardwood floors in our house, and a piece of wood is 4 feet, 5 feet long. And so to get a nice size, you know, and this is for 2 boards, we're going to want something in the range of, you know, 8 to 10 feet. And so I can say 10 feet here. And now all of a sudden this image is going to be the right size, the right look, the right feel. So modifying this material or this image is for this asset, and again, it could be a shared asset, but the only performance that may be happening is only the only effect that this will happen is during rendering. Okay, you're adding a little bit of just a little bit more bulk to the file, and that might be, but remember that most of these are stored. Okay, so if there are materials that you're not using, you can always purge out material references from the file. But also know that it's not using the render image. You're not going to slow down your panning and your drawing because it only utilizes it when you're in realistic mode or rendering mode. Otherwise, it doesn't even look at the textures, and so you're fine. The render setup, by the way, we haven't looked at the render window yet, but the low medium res does not tie into the selection of the materials. You can choose the selection of the material. That's all just based on this. Revit gives you the 3 different folders. Autodesk gives you the 3 different folders so that you can choose, because you could have a low res for like concrete, where you don't need a high resolution image. But if you want the wood grain, if you want the marble countertops to have a nice resolution on an image, then use the higher resolution for those. And it also depends on how much you're zoomed in. So there's also another thing is not every material is available in low medium res. Some are available only in the low. Chain link fence, by the way, is not available in high res. It's only available in low res because of the size. There was no reason to have a high resolution image. Okay, so the resolution of the images for these assets does not tie into the render setup in any way. It's only tied to the texture that you're creating right here, right now. Okay, so once you have looked at this scale, the sample size, now this is the right size. Okay, so the right size. When you hit done, this is now affected. And by the way, if you're using the preview image up here on top, make sure that you're choosing something similar. Instead of a box, use a plane. This will be so that it references the floor. How will this look? There's also the ability to choose your render setting for the preview image. So draft, medium, production quality. And again, this is just the preview image. It might take a little bit higher or longer time to get the preview image. Okay. Now, when dealing with, say, this floor, okay, there's 2 different options here, because there is tint and there's stain. Okay. So stain works on the material itself, where tint will affect the overall image of it, and you'll see it turn very dark here. And so be careful which one you use. Test each one. And wood's special because it has this stain option versus the tint option. Okay. So this is a wood option. I wanted to show that here. I've created for my image, I used something very similar. I swapped out some of the materials. I used the stain option for a white and to give it more of a whitewashed look versus the darker standard color that it defaults to. Okay. Now there's also things called relief. Now in wood it's relief. If we were going up to tile, or so any generic, it's called bump. Okay, same thing if we were to look at some of the other options here. They have different options. I'm trying to find a metal. There's a stone. Stone has finish, bump, and relief. Okay, and so what happens with these bump files, if you're not familiar with it, relief, bump, anything like that, is it's the amount to which here's brick, it's the amount to which we get some recess image. It gives the texture, it gives it some thickness. And so when using bump or relief, okay, you use a black-white contrasted image. So if you have some Photoshop people in your office, that works really well. Run it through a monochrome filter, and then really push and pull the contrast to get very darks, very lights. Because what happens is the dark will pull in, the light will pull out, and so the bump and the relief and those texture patterns give the wood its rough grain, give the brick here the recess, and I will show that here. Make that image just a little bit bigger for us to see. And you can see with this bump, if I crank it up and let it do its updating in a short second, it's going to look like the brick is starting to protrude. It's going to give, as you see, it's a little bit easier to see on my screen, but I recommend you take a look at it back at the office. It really pulls back the mortar joints. On tile, it will pull back the grout lines. On ceiling tile, again, it really does give it that popcorny depth. When you're looking at it, and it's all based on the black to white. And so take that image, and then you'll see the bump. And again, Revit has the default map libraries, material libraries have bump maps in there, and you'll see them tagged with bump. Okay, you see this one has some of the same setups, so the bump map for a lot of these. Okay, and that'll give it the texture. So Revit has some of these built in, by the way, but if you need to build your own, you can utilize that. There's also the ability to, if you don't want to use an image, you can use this little drop-down button on the right and use a non-standard bump. And so if you're using tile, this will give you the grout lines. It can be used for brick as well if you set the sizes correctly to get the offsets. But you can use some of these. I've used things like noise and speckle to create texture on beds or linens to give it just a little bit of depth where Revit really doesn't have it because it's a flat wall, it's a flat surface. There's also waves and wood too, so if you don't have a good bump map or relief map, you can use these default ones to utilize inside it. And so we use these to really give texture and feel. When we're talking about reality, the renderings we're showing right now are very flat, and so adding that texture, adding that feel to it and then mess around with it. There's really no right or wrong number here. It's all about the feel of the image. Okay, and so especially with carpet being flat, crank up that relief, crank up that bump, and you kind of get that texture to it. If you're doing exterior and you're doing grass, use a texture to that, and that'll give it. It makes it feel like there's depth in the grass, in the carpet, in the flooring. And so the intent is to trick the user's eye. Okay, and so these are really part of it. Now, a lot of times, another one to look at is we have this tint, and that one's important because where we come to look at things like paint, okay, if I look for siding here, okay, clapboard siding, I pull this guy up, it's going to show up in my images here, and as it's updating, the image will pop around here. There we go. You'll notice that it is a beige, and for good reason. It's the material is siding panel wood beige, and the asset is called beige. Okay, but when we're trying to paint walls, when we're trying to add materialization to our project, different materials, different paint. We're going to have beige over here. We're going to have green over here. We're going to have blue, and so having materials that match those colors are important. Okay, and so a lot of times, I'm going to slide this up. We need to first of all duplicate the asset because we don't want to modify the beige. Okay. If I duplicate the asset, it renames it. Just called it 1. But under here, under information dropdown, I can rename this and call it green. I would give it a more specific color. If you're using a very specific color match, that might be something to look into. That something you're trying to match. But for me right now, I just pop that in. You might want to edit some of the keywords, but the image can stay the same, because we can change the tint. And so from that, I can choose say a green color, or I don't know, I'm trying to find something a little classier. Okay. Hit okie dokie. And as this updates, I now have green siding for my building. Now be careful again, because we have materials. Okay, and these materials, the asset is tied to the appearance tab, which is tied to the material itself, and so we're managing both. And so we might need to make siding clapboard dash green, siding clapboard dash beige, but then also make sure that you rename the asset as well, because again, shared resource. Okay, so this works really good for paint. This works really good for other things. Now, materials don't always have to be applied to the assembly. We wouldn't want to have to run around to every single wall, because it is clapboard, it's clapboard. It's gyp, it's gyp. But if we want where we want to paint one wall, paint another wall, we wouldn't have to manage the materialization of the object itself. We can always paint. And so now here I am, I'm in the material browser, and you can generate different paint option, or different material options for your different paint colors. Okay, but what you can do is, as we close this, from the project I have here, you can paint the walls. And so I'm going to just jump into this image here, and forgive me, I gotta close the. Oh, this is my rendering. Sorry. Okay. If I switch to realistic mode here, I can use the modify button. I can use the paint tool and choose that material. QRS SS. Did I not? I may not have saved that. However, I can choose a different material to paint on, say, the wall. So I can choose brick and paint the wall here. And now you see on the right I have brick, even though I didn't edit the wall to have brick. So it's good to know. One of the things I was asked, and forgive me, I don't know fully the answer because there's some technicalities, is the compatibility between Revit, 3ds Max, and AutoCAD as far as material libraries. Now, Revit utilizes a shared material library inside this material dialog box down at the lower left. Those existing material libraries, those are the shared Autodesk libraries, and so they are shared. The material definitions. Okay, if I drop this down, the Autodesk materials are shared. However, when you transfer, Revit is converting your file into an FBX file, and that a lot of times that may require creating new materials or applying new materials in 3ds Max. It's worth looking into more. If you're interested in that, email or fill out the request for information in the survey after, and we can get our 3ds Max expert to respond to that, any of those particular inquiries. I'm very much a Revit renderer, and so just wanted to put that out there. Okay. So using materials as paint is an excellent way to apply colors to your surfaces without actually affecting the quantification or the materialization of things like floor systems and wall systems inside your project. Okay, and so again, that was the Modify Paint button. Okay, so adding paints. Now, like I was saying, there's a lot more to materials, and I really wanted to point out those main portions. Is that the out-of-the-box materials are either the wrong scale or they're using the low res, and so look into swapping it out for the same styles, or if you want to create new materials, don't be willing to look inside that material dialog box, and if you need that, let me know. Otherwise, it's searchable. Autodesk has it on their website where to go. Take a look at those as well. Okay. And materials versus assets. Duplicate your assets. Duplicate your materials as necessary. It's a big thing. Okay. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about is lighting. And we could do a whole, and I think I have done a whole workflow on talking about lighting inside Revit. But knowing the difference between sun and artificial and the settings, and that their properties are relative, not actual, and then also looking at some of the limitations of lighting families and where we need to talk about something called the self-illuminated material. Okay, I'm going to jump back into Revit here. First of all, the content that we get, this particular one, and I wanted to point it out because it is off-seek. This is the Visa lighting fixture from Visa Lighting, and this is a common issue that people come across. Is you go out to look for content, and I got this family, and here it is, and I got it off of Seek, which is supposed to be really good, and for the most part it is. But what ends up happening is when I bring that piece of content into my Revit project, it doesn't render. I get all black. Why did it do that? And that's because this particular family, edit family, had, this is not Revit geometry. If I pick and choose, there's actually a CAD SAT file, import symbol. Okay, a lot of manufacturers right now are using their mechanical files and importing the CAD, importing the SketchUp, importing the other pieces of non-Revit content into their families. And so what I had to do is create the globe and the shell for this this for this lighting fixture, because it's the CAD when attempting to render wasn't rendering properly. Okay? And so because also it can't be materialized, there's no material ability because this is a solid, not individual Revit pieces such as my globe here or my frame here. Okay, and then we have the light object inside the Revit environment, and notice it's rotated. And so I'll show you what will happen when we bring this into our project. Okay. And so here I have it in my project, and right now, currently, I have it off. I added a quick parameter just to turn off the visibility of that object. Okay, and here it is on. Okay, and it's a big solid. Okay, and if you try to hit render, even if I was to turn it to low or something right now, just a quick run through, what you'll see is once it runs through is nothing at all. This is one light object in a closed space, and notice that you can't see anything. The light object is buried inside this fixture, and that fixture is blocking the light because it's CAD based, because it doesn't have materialization, because it's not designed to work. Okay, so I'm going to jump back in here. Again, I'm going to turn it off, turn off that CAD piece. Okay, and now you can see the materialization I have. And so I created these two pieces, just a rim around the top, and then I created a glass globe. Okay, and that's another piece too, is when we're looking at things like when we're looking at other Revit-like fixtures, the one common thing I hear is, hey, I put in the can light, I put in this light fixture, it added light to my space, but it doesn't look like the light is on. And that's because the Revit light object, the Revit light object, let me jump back, sorry about that. The Revit light object doesn't glow. Okay, so here's these can lights. Okay, if I edit family, this is the default out-of-box Revit downlight. And if it gives it a second, it's going to open it up. It didn't like that I moved my laptop before we started tinkering here, and so it's taking us time to think. But there is not a light bulb inside the downlight recess can out-of-box Revit. There's no light bulb. And so if there's no light bulb, how can that light bulb glow? And so here we have the light fixture, but if I rotate underneath, you'll notice it's just a can. There's no bulb in there. So when you hit render, there's no light bulb to glow. There's nothing there. Another thing to know is that even though there's no light, so there may not be light bulb, but what if you're using a wall sconce? What if you're using this light? Okay, now this light, I have it open in my other, okay, this light has geometry. Hide that guy. I have geometry. Okay, but if I tell it to render, okay, if I go in and I tell it to render, I jump to just glass material. This is what's going to happen. The light is able to shine out of the light because it's we created materialization. It has it's glass, so it allows the light to transfer. But Revit objects do not glow due to lighting. Lighting does not diffuse into a lampshade or a globe or a light bulb. The light object, the yellow symbol, does not illuminate materials. And thus, this globe of this light is a frequent issue that a lot of people have, that, hey, my light doesn't even look like it's on. I got light, my room is lighting, but it is not on. And so what we have to do is create a self-illuminated material. Okay, so if I jump to my my view here, I have my light object. Okay, and inside it, I've added a globe material. And so at first I had glass frosted, and if I go to the Appearance tab, it says I'm glass. Okay, and great, glass, cool. It's got color, it's got reflection, it's got all that nice stuff, but you know what it does? It doesn't have a glow. If you choose a generic material, there's an option called self-illumination, and self-illumination will give it a glow. Now here's the caveat here. Self-illumination will make the physical geometry look like it's glowing. This does not throw light. It cannot be substituted for a light object. You need a light object to throw the light. You need an illuminated material to glow as if lit. So using frosted glass, a lampshade, a TV screen, anything like that to make it look like it's glowing, to have it lit, you have to have the geometry for the glass, or for the object itself, so the bulb, or here the globe of the light, but then you have to give it illumination. And so that illumination, here I have some luminance, and like I said, you got to tinker with those values to get it to look right. Okay? And so when that is set to illuminated glass, when we do our rendering, okay, all of a sudden now the light is glowing. Okay, the bulb glows, the sconce is lit, the lampshade has vibrance to it. Okay, and so a lot of families default out of box do not have illuminated materials to make it look like it's glowing, and so you need to have that. Okay. Yep, this is, so when I created this, I created it myself. I started with a generic material, because generic materials, so I started a new material. I added a generic asset to it that I duplicated, okay? And I use generic because generic has self-illumination, and that's the one I want. And then also, by the way, be careful, because for light to transfer through it, you need to make it transparent. And so as a frosted glass, I did 90% transparency. So self-illuminated materials are good. And again, self-illuminated materials do not actually have light. They light themselves. But if I did not have a light object in that light fixture, the light symbol would glow, but there would be no light on the walls. Okay, let me just jump back to the light fixture. This yellow light source definition. If it did not have it, there would be no light. The globe would glow, but that glow does not distribute light onto other objects. Okay. So we're getting some good questions. I'll take some time to answer those quick here, since that's some of the last things I wanted to talk about. And one of them does point to one of the tips I was going to mention, and that's using the cloud. If you're not using the cloud right now, know that that rendering takes time and effort. Okay, on your machine, if I'm using the render dialog box, okay, and I jump over here, if I'm using my machine to render on the View tab, the render button, Okay, I hit the render button. We have these settings. Now, your video card does not matter. Okay, it's important to know this. Revit rendering utilizes the CPU, so your chip, your computer chip, not your graphics card. Okay, that's important to know that all Autodesk products, whether it's 3ds Max, whether it's Revit, whether it's AutoCAD, use the CPU to render. Though they have this NVIDIA Mental Ray, that's just because they own it. That's the company who owns it. It does not use your graphics card. Okay, and so there are people who have render machines that utilize graphics, so they have the Quadro Super blah blah blah. It will not help you unless you're using 3ds Max with a with a hardware rendering plugin. No Autodesk products use the graphics card by default. So important to know that. Two, I like using the cloud because if you're using rendering on your machine, first of all, because it uses all your CPUs and you can't tell it not to, it's very hard to do anything else. Even if it's checking email or trying to hop on the web, it's using your machine to chew it up. Okay? So I like to use the render in the cloud option. Okay, it utilizes your 360 login. It goes up to the cloud, and even if you have no cloud credits available, you can do up to, see, 0 required. You can do up to a medium, and that's important because even whether you're rendering in the Revit environment or whether you're rendering in the cloud, medium is where where a lot of things start to happen. The light bounce physics and the full rendering of light objects, such as spheres or linear, so shaped lighting fixtures, will begin to render, and the materials start to have a good look to it. And so you can do. Can you do a final medium? Nope. So you can do up to a standard medium for free. Okay, and use this because one, it's quick. So if you have a large space or you have even a small space, you can shoot it up to the cloud, and it will get you a good test, a good feel. You can see your lights, you can see if it's too bright or too dark, and you can do some tinkering. Okay, but you can go up to a medium without using any credits at all. And then if you want to turn that up a notch, you can, and it'll take the credits you have left. And there's a wait. Okay? Or if you think you got it, you like these settings, it's starting to look good, that's when you can come back to your Revit environment, hit the render, crank that bad boy up. I'm going to cancel that because that would take forever. Okay? And get you your, you can do this and use your super settings set up inside your rendering dialog box. Okay? And then walk away, set it to go for the night. Because these a very large rendering on a high setting can take a large amount of time. So whether you're using the cloud for your finals, whether you're using the cloud for your tests, take a look at it. It's free up to medium. There's no reason not to. Okay. And by the way, the cloud. The cloud can take decals, it can take custom materials, it will load up what you have in your view, it will load that up to the cloud, it'll do the rendering. You're not sending your project up there, you're only sending the scene. Okay, so know that too, you're not sending your whole project up to the cloud. All right. Now, once something is rendered in the cloud, there are settings that you can do. So there is some post-processing that you can tinker with, and so when it first becomes rendered, you have the ability to render using new settings, adjust your exposure, and so you can monitor exposure values, white point, saturation, and so one of the questions is the render can have a hue to it. They all do. Even the default in Revit rendering can have a certain look, but you have the ability to adjust your exposure. Again, it's from this drop down on the cloud, adjust exposure. Okay, tinker with your settings, get the feel right. I know a lower or one of the lower or higher white point will adjust it more towards a less yellow, more bluish, and so tinker with these settings. And they're the same settings, by the way, available in your the Revit environment after the rendering is complete. You can use your settings after the rendering. Okay, so there was a lot of good questions. If you have additional questions, please send it to me. But we're running up to against the hour. I honestly thought this would have been a shorter webinar, but I'm glad I got to fill up your time. I hope you found this useful. As you see, there's a lot more that can be said and a lot more that can be done. And this was just a slice off the top, but these are some of the common mistakes when people are talking about the reality. Okay, and the things to remember again is the content we put in our project. Make it look real. Add in a table setting. Add a little plant on the counter. You know, utilize those types of things. Then we talk about materialization, and know the out-of-the-box materials are not default. We should take a little bit of time, make sure they're using the higher res versions, create your own materials. Go out to the web and find, there's tons of places that have material swatches that you can use. Build your own. I enjoy it myself. I have a nice library that I like to use. And then again, when we talk about lighting, the biggest thing is the self-illuminated materials. Get my lights looking just right.